Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society here at Dartmouth and a professor in environmental studies. And I'm really excited today about our panel for our first winter term Dartmouth Energy Collaborative seminar series. After COP26 in Glasgow, a lot of us have been, there's so many promises, where's action? And today's panel is going to help us engage on that topic in some really fun and interesting ways. First, we'll be hearing from Scott Foster, 79, and working at the UN now. And then we'll be hearing from Jennie Stephens at Northeastern University and head of the policy school there. And then from Victoria Holt, who's head of the Dickey Center here and who's worked a lot of her career internationally. We were driven to start this theme this term in part by our students who are saying, enough of the promises. We know this is an issue. What can we do? And what I've appreciated about the panel we have here, they'll be giving about 5 minutes of remarks, then we'll open it up for discussion. So please put your questions into the Q&A and we'll queue them up in the open discussion period. But as they share our impatience and they share our desire for change in international organizations, in the education sector, and on the ground in some of the hardest hit places in the world. So with that, first we'll be hearing from Scott and then Jennie and then Tori, and 5 minutes each. Scott, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. I will say it's a hallelujah moment when everybody agrees, let's get something actually done. I would like to make my remarks along 5 different topics. The first one is what I call all paths leading to Rome. You've got all the commitments that countries have made, both to the 2030 agenda and to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And yet every country's got its own natural resources. It's got its own heritage of cultural, regulatory, legislative. So they're all going to find their own way, if you will, to the future. It's interesting to look at what's common for all of the countries. You have got to realize that countries and communities and even individuals are going to be acting out of self-interest. So it's an interesting challenging for us to find how can we get that self-interest aligned with what society needs. In a first instance, we would expect solutions to be pragmatic, to be effective, economic in terms of environment and societal objectives as well. What we're looking for is some delivery of quality of life. That's what citizens are expecting. And you can call quality of life either through the Paris Agreement or through the 2030 Agenda. We actually need integrated solutions. The second topic I would like to talk about are the giants standing in the road. And if you say, I can look forward standing on the shoulders of giants, that means I should be able to see to a far more distant future. They should be able to help me along on that path. And yet the giants of today, the giants of the energy world, there's a lot of finger pointing going on saying, evil, evil, you've done bad things, leave it in the ground, you've polluted our world. There's a different way of thinking about those companies, that industry, those industries, I should say. We should be able to use their capital, their technology, their skills, inviting somehow industry to be part of the change, to even lead the change, rather than being simply the victim of change. And that really means getting the rules of the game in place to get the framework conditions for decisions, for investments. That means prices on carbon, that means rules-based trading systems. Those are all critical elements if we get these self-interested agents pointing in the right direction. The third point I would like to raise, we've developed at the UN ECE, where I work, 6 specific actions that over the short term and long term, we believe will deliver on the 2030 agenda, and they will deliver on the Paris Climate Agreement. The first set of short-term items are improving the performance of the built environment of buildings. Second item therein is dealing with methane, controlling the emissions of methane, transforming them into CO2. But if we don't deal with the methane issue, we've got a huge problem on our hands. And then the third item is sustainable resource management. People think that everybody who goes out and digs are doing bad things, but we need rare earth elements. We need critical raw materials for the batteries, for the electric vehicles. So there's got to be some kind of coherent sustainable resource management in place that allows us to achieve our objectives without creating bigger problems. Now, on the longer term slate, how are we going to get to carbon neutrality? We've got to have solutions that deliver reductions in carbon emissions. In fact, get the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere going down. We've got to do that in a way that brings all of the countries along. We've got to have a just transition. We can't expect, like Thanos, to snap our fingers and have all of these industries just disappear. There's so many communities that have an urban and industrial ecosystem around a primary energy source. If we don't come up with solutions for those communities, those countries are not going to come along. So we've got to have a just transition system in place. And then finally, let's put together a hydrogen ecosystem of the future. I'm picking probably a bit too much on hydrogen, but it's about electrons and it's about molecules. Let's find a way to deal with electricity and gases that are renewable and allow us to reduce the overall carbon intensity. That brings me to my fourth item, which is who are the agents of change? And we're finding at the UN, you know, I can go out how many times and cut some ribbons and nice, what happened? Nothing. We're engaging a lot more now with local community players and actors, people whose daily existence depend on improving their quality of life while helping address the climate change issue, and enabling them to take their roles, to do the things that they can do, is critically important. On the other side, I've already mentioned them, is industry. Let's put in place the right framework conditions, and they will make the investments, they will take the decisions that are needed to deliver the outcomes. Before I joined the UN, I was working for a management consultancy. Our work with industry showed that they were prepared to act, but that the politics weren't in place. That's not the case anymore. The final point I'd like to raise is we need to deliver energy as a service as opposed to energy as a commodity. Holding up a phone, this has not been done to energy yet. If we can put it where we're delivering quality of life instead of volumes of coal, then we're going to be making a huge change. I can elaborate that a little bit more later. I'll stop there, Elizabeth, and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's really interesting to think about how that evolution has happened over time in terms of which actors are pushing and which are pulling. Jennie, I know your work in the higher ed sector has been one of a lot of pushing. Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences at the COP and where you see action happening? Thank you.
Thank you, and great to be here and virtually visiting the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. So thanks for the invitation to join the panel. I have been working on climate energy issues for my whole career, so for 25 years or so, and have been to, I was in Glasgow for COP26 in November, and it was my third COP that I attended. I was also in Copenhagen and in Paris. And what I'd like to kind of shed some light on or elevate a little bit is the need for a new approach that focuses more explicitly on social innovation, not just the technological innovation. So for decades, you know, we've been talking about and we have been investing, particularly in the United States, a lot of our investment has been on technology. And technology, of course, is critical to what is needed to address the climate crisis and transition away from fossil fuel reliant society toward a renewable based, but it's not enough. Technology alone is integrally connected to social structures, power dynamics, obviously the economic situation. And so a lot of my work really focuses on the need for thinking about social change, social innovation, transformation, understanding and distributing and diversifying power. And what we see over the past 10, 20 years is actually an extreme concentration of wealth and power. And many of the people and the billionaires and polluter elites organizations that have been capitalizing, profiting off of fossil fuel use have been intentionally obstructing efforts for climate action. So I think the big picture, we need to get local in our communities, in our states, in our regions, in the organizations we work with, to expand the conversation beyond technology and greenhouse gas emission reductions and really think more deeply about the power dynamics of who is advocating for what, why has it been so hard, and we need to resist the climate obstructionism that is really quite prevalent. So I wrote a book last year or 2 years ago now called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And in that book, I elevate the stories of amazing leaders around, mostly in the United States, but around the world, who are taking a different approach to climate and energy by connecting climate and energy issues with health, with economic justice, with education and housing and food systems, right? And these issues are all interconnected. And one of the things that I think another key piece of that is acknowledging and calling out the power of the fossil fuel interests in particular. And that was what happened at COP in November in a way that it hadn't previously. Fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal have not been previously explicitly mentioned in the language of any previous COP. But the language at the end of the Glasgow did explicitly mention phasing out oil and gas. Phasing out coal, and then some mention of oil and gas. And so the being more explicit about that is essential. I was just in a meeting actually earlier this morning with a group of climate social scientists who study climate obstructionism, and many of those researchers are actually getting challenged by industry representatives about their work with FOIA requests and things. So there's this complicated divisiveness that has emerged that we need to kind of work on in a way that puts people's priorities for communities and really the climate justice angle, I guess, more front and center. A lot of us have been talking about climate action, but I think if we broaden that to climate justice action, we are explicitly putting the power dynamics and the problematic concentration of wealth that has been perpetuated by sustaining the status quo, not from transitioning. And I've also written quite a lot about energy democracy, which is the idea of redistributing power literally and figuratively. Not only is there opportunities for distributed, renewable-based, regionally appropriate mix of energy in different regions and around the world, but we can also, as we invest in that very different energy future, we can invest in communities and throughout the world in ways that also distribute economic power as well and political power. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much to think about these larger societal ideals and how they've changed over time. And Tori, your experience internationally and in the US is really helpful then for thinking about how we're operationalizing on the ground.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Elizabeth, for organizing this and for inviting this discussion. And it's a wonderful thing to follow both Scott and Jenny. I like energy democracy, and I do think that energy should be treated not as a commodity, but as a service. So let me tell you a little bit. So I run the John Sloan Dickey Center here at Dartmouth for International Understanding. We're a multidisciplinary center focused on global issues and international engagement. But I'm also speaking about a project I've been involved with called Powering Peace, which uses analysis, research, and engagement with policymakers in countries in the field and with UN to try and think about how you get more access to renewable energy and use in fragile states. So this is directly related to COP26 because we know there's a massive gap between the ambitions of nations and others at the COP and actually delivering in the field. So as a former diplomat and policymaker, we're always about implementation and trying to connect to the local and to the change. So at that COP, there was a side panel, and there were a number of UN officials who got together and they re-announced the Secretary General's pledge that the UN would try and meet its own goals of being 80% based on renewable energy by 2030. Now, how does this actually matter? Stephanie, if you're with me, maybe we could turn to a slide of the countries of the world. It's small, I'm sorry, but you see some of them are lit up. The reason I'm highlighting these countries, many in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, but also Afghanistan, I think Myanmar and Haiti are on there, is there's 27 countries roughly with three major things going. They're affected by conflict, they're affected by climate change, and they have low access to energy, or what's sometimes called energy poverty. So you can roughly see this is a group of countries for which climate change is very real, energy access is needed, and they're impacted also by conflict, which makes it tough for them to take advantage of the transformation in renewable energy and technology that's happening worldwide, as well as financing and development to support energy access. Thanks, Stephanie. I think you can take that down for now. If you look out at the world, roughly 6% of global climate finance in 2019, 2020 goes to Africa and the Middle East combined. And only a fraction of that goes to fragile states. So they're being left behind. So how does this relate? There's one group, the United Nations, that goes to many of these countries. They deploy large peacekeeping missions. Mali, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo. There are countries, Central African Republic, Lebanon, many others. There's roughly 12 large missions today, and they go in. What's a peacekeeping mission? Civilian-led, come in with military and police to provide support to peace agreements, political solutions, and protect civilians. But they often spend hundreds of millions of dollars on their own infrastructure and their own costs for electricity and energy. And the question is, what fuel are they using? They're 96% reliant on diesel today. The good news is they have ambitions to change, but that won't happen without the engagement of the larger climate, development, and local communities where they operate. This makes sense for the missions. It's good for their mandates. They could reduce supply chain insecurity and save money. It's also good for many of the countries they serve in, where the UN can be the largest emitter in these places. Between 10 and 23% of emissions in CAR, Mali, South Sudan, and Somalia come from the UN's operations. They have large geographic footprints, and so they could use their purchasing power to work on energy access and energy as a service. We've done case studies in a number of these countries. South Sudan has inside the fence built some solar panels and a field, but in Somalia, they're using energy as a service for the first time with local entrepreneurs who are trying to provide it to the UN mission. Field research matters because every place is different, but putting together access to energy, climate goals, and the role of UN mission for peace can not only be a tool for peace building, energy access, but long-term climate change. So back to the Secretary General's pledge of 80%. The good news is he's made that pledge and the UN is meant to move to 80% renewable energy by 2030. But they can't do it without moving these large peacekeeping missions into that direction. So that also means we have to accelerate things such as were announced at the COP of large climate finance. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been put up to try and support innovation and technological change. But as Jenny points out, it has to also work with the communities locally. So what do? We leverage the commitment of financing with the smart development actors in these fields, the local communities, and the host nations to work with UN operations around the world to figure out how to use their resources to leverage access to energy for the missions and for the populations they serve to meet the climate goals of the countries they're operating in. Happy to get into details. We've done case studies in Mali, we're finishing one in Somalia. We've operated also in South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and happy to share some reports. Thanks, Elizabeth.
No, I really appreciate this. I mean, one of the pieces that, people get so geared up for the COPs. This is going to happen. There's going to be these great meetings and wonderful commitments. And Scott, you'd made the comment earlier of, people are promising so much and then not doing anything. And even with those big promises, they're actually not promising enough. And so as someone who's at the UN, how do you think about those gaps?
Well, there are a couple of comments I've got to make. I've been to several COPs as well, and I made this remark just last week to colleagues. They really are zoos, and you end up with, if you will, a castle with a fairground around, and inside the castle is where the negotiations are going on, where all of the research and analysis and preparations arrive there, and around you have 20,000 people who have flown to some faraway place in order to make their noises heard. So the COP process itself, I'm personally challenged by. There are two gaps that emerge in my view. The first gap is between the commitments that are made, and some countries are making more commitments than others, and are they getting close? Collectively, they're not enough. But then you look at what they're actually doing compared to what they've committed to do, and they're falling short as well. So I saw your quote in the paper about 2.5 degrees from the Washington Post. The impression I have is that it's 1/4 past midnight on the doomsday clock for climate change. We're way late in responding. We've got not only to get busy, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. And until the political elites are empowered by the electorates to take and act legitimately, they're not going to do anything. Their objective in life is to get reelected, and it stops there. This is my comment about self-interest. We've got to be prepared to give the politicians the power to deliver on their commitments.
So I hear those words, and we saw in places like France where we had the Gilets jaunes, where you had this tension between the end of the world and the end of the month. And one of the questions here from Philip Chernock, who's a visiting Fulbright scholar here at Dartmouth and also from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic, he asked, just transitions were mentioned. This implies financial transfers within countries, but also from the global north to the global south. At the same time, in his limited experience, it's difficult to find the resources for a strong energy transition, even in rich countries like Germany. In this context, how realistic is the massive transfer of money that will be needed? And this is for all of you. So let's start with Tori, and then go Jenny, and then go to Scott.
Usually I'm not as much of an energy expert as many of you. I come more from a peace security background. But usually what happens is organizations need their incentives changed. They're not against, say, Elizabeth, transferring funding, but they may have other goals that are predominant. In some ways, that's what I'm describing with this project, trying to look at fragile states, getting access to energy. It feels like a no-brainer, but what we've discovered is something as simple as changing the efficiency measure of a 1-year budget cycle versus 5. Renewable energy often pays out over multiple years. But if you're only estimating budget savings on a yearly basis, diesel will win every time. So what you have to look at these institutions, whether it's Germany or South Sudan,
or Dartmouth
structures, or Dartmouth, what's the structure and how do you change the incentive system? Because there's usually more than one place that you can meet multiple goals. So that's kind of the philosophy I think we're arguing for here. Is you can, I've been in communities where people are like, oh, you're not talking about climate change, you're talking about peacekeeping. I'm like, can we talk about both? So I think in some senses, that's what we have to do.
I think that's really interesting because you are aligning, just through that structural change of budgeting, the ability of people to make different decisions. Jenny, how do you see that playing out in higher ed?
Well, first I'm going to respond to Philip's question a little bit more directly, absolutely. And then I'll get to higher ed. And
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think what's really important, the resources, how are we going to pay for this, right? That's the question that politically is always brought up. And that's the question, I think, partly what Philip is asking about, and then this transfer of money. And I'm going to go ahead and say that we need to mainstream the idea of a massive transfer of money, right? Because there was an Oxfam report last week just published that just during the pandemic, in the past less than 2 years, that the top 10 billionaires doubled their wealth, right? And there was a new billionaire created every day during the pandemic, whereas the other 98% were, most people's wealth was declining. So if you think that's okay, then we just keep doing things. If you don't think that's okay, which I don't think that's okay, I don't think it's good for any of us, and it's not even good for those top 10 billionaires because the whole world is falling apart around them. We do need a massive transfer and taxes on those billionaires, and they could contribute. We could pay for all of this if we just taxed half of those earnings they made during COVID, right? So, I mean, I think we need to start mainstreaming discussions about these wealth transfers, because the conventional approach of just keeping it, oh, too bad the billionaires keep getting richer and richer, but nothing we can do about it. Like at some point, it's gonna really break, and it isn't appropriate. So I think that's one piece of it. With regard to higher ed, I wanted to touch on that. So I've been in the higher ed sector, you know, as a university professor, my whole career, and originally was in science and engineering and more focused on the technology and the science of climate and energy, and more recently in the policy space, and thinking more about the social change and policy changes that need to happen. And I think there's so much that universities can be doing to broaden these conversations, and engage with our students and in our communities to connect climate and energy more explicitly with all these other social justice issues, including the billionaires and getting richer and richer. And so we can come back to that with more details as we talk more about specific action steps. But I think it's a really important question. And I'm actually going on sabbatical next year, and the focus of my sabbatical is what are the transformations that are needed in higher ed to promote and facilitate and encourage and advance the transformations that are needed in society. Because some of the things we're doing in higher ed, especially in our elite places, are actually perpetuating some of the challenges that we actually want to disrupt. So we have opportunities to kind of reevaluate how we do things and how we engage, both with research, teaching, and engaging with communities that we can talk more about for sure.
Great. And Scott, could you talk a little bit about the wealth transfer issue and how you see that, or what some of your insights might be?
I will comment on it. In terms of the amount of funding for a just transition, you're talking about global north to south. When I mentioned just transition, it was more how do you get communities to move away from that primary source to another one, which does involve investment. The ideas that we've been pushing are for a real price on carbon. That would first of all generate revenues, and those revenues could be used to invest in the infrastructure that's required to deliver the energy services, which is clearly high on the development agenda. Those will involve financial transfers and financial flows. If they're done as gifts and grants, that won't be interesting to anybody. But when I look at the example of Germany, as is listed here, the amount of money that they've paid for renewables and investment in renewables, is that worth it on a per ton of carbon emitted basis? I think that has to be explored, if I can say that. Now, Elizabeth, you mentioned the Gilets jaunes. I would say that that's a perfect example of a carbon tax done badly. I said that in public. I probably shouldn't do so, but there you go. If I want to get people out of their cars, and that was the point of the carbon tax, and people can't afford it, I've got to provide them with an alternative that's affordable, that takes them to their destination, that's clean, that's safe, that's reliable. There's about 7 other characteristics that are required. They didn't do any of that. All they did was dump a price on people who had no other choices. I was completely in agreement with the initial objections of the Gilets jaunes, because that's not the way you should do public policy. You should bring it in a progressive and coherent way so that it delivers the results. You get the infrastructure in place and migrate people onto that infrastructure. The same is true between North and South. The North can't simply say, we're going to put a price on carbon, even though we caused this problem. You have to pay for it by not going down the development path. That's not the right way. There needs to be a rules-based trading system, a price on carbon, and guide investments into the developing world. That's how I would view it. You're muted, Elizabeth.
I know. I've appreciated this tension between the need for being inclusive and thinking about the big problem, while also these local tensions. And there's a question here that asks, I appreciate both Scott's point that we need a big tent and to figure out how to leverage gain from the big energy industry, and Jennie's efforts to hold big oil accountable for obfuscating climate impacts. How do we reconcile this? We'll let Tori start.
Well, so again, my goal is not that what I'm describing will single-handedly stop climate change, but look to places where there is a merger of interests. And some of the places I'm describing, fragile states, the populations have very low access to energy, often well below 20% in some of the countries you're describing. The world is giving money from a development point of view to support access to energy. So also include not just the big companies, but here we need small entrepreneurs. We need enough development to bring in access to renewables, whether it's wind, solar, hydro, like in Eastern Congo, Virunga National Park has been a big part of that, to basically be creative all over across the planet. And that also gets to one of the questions here about countries and companies pledging for net zero. And much of that is bought up by offsets. And I want to point out, I have colleagues who've created something called the Peace Renewable Energy Credit Market. They're trying to sell credits to support investment in fragile states, giving people offsets, but using that resource to help build infrastructure where large projects worried about insecurity may not go. So again, I'm not arguing this is the solution to all climate change, but let's look for innovation everywhere, particularly where it's local and where we may not just be dealing with the big corporations, but with local people, with governments who want to do the right thing.
Great. Yeah, and I'll chime in here with kind of a framing about fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel regulation. Like one of the things that emerged in COP was a coalition of government leaders who signed on to a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Like basically, if you understand the climate science, you know that we have to reduce fossil fuel reliance, right? And that's like, it shouldn't be controversial to say that, right? It shouldn't be controversial to come up with regulations and policies that do that. And we have been, almost a lot of the energy policy has been promoting new things like renewables, hydrogen, nuclear. There are other things. What are the other options other than fossil fuels? But there's been very little policy and regulation explicitly restricting fossil fuel extraction and production and combustion. And so there's a whole movement to actually do that. Like, and obviously the fossil fuel interests will resist those efforts. But a part of the energy democracy framework acknowledges resist, reclaim, and restructure, right? And some of our research in my research team has shown that there's more policies on the reclaim and restructure and move forward toward renewables, but there isn't as much policy yet on the resist, the existing infrastructure, right? The legacy systems that are so deeply ingrained, not just technologically, but socially. Like we think to ourselves, how would I live without access to fossil fuels, right? And it changes everything, right? And it connects deeply. But we have to start having those uncomfortable conversations because that's the bottom line of kind of the next generation of climate policy, I think. So I think we can acknowledge and reveal the power and influence and the obstructionism of these companies and industries. And at the same time, they're there. We need to collaborate and work on how to advance and make it so we can't just not talk about fossil fuels anymore, right? Like that's what we have been doing, and it hasn't really worked.
Scott, do you want to weigh in on this one?
If I can come in real quick, about 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, the share of fossil in the energy mix was 80%. This year, the share of fossil in the energy mix is about 81%. So the amount of energy we're consuming is much greater. So anybody who thinks that we're doing anything that's effective is completely out of their minds. It isn't working. The idea that we're having these debates about the supply and where's the supply come from, to my view, is actually asking the wrong question. I sound like iRobot. That is the right question. I find that focusing on the energy needed and the energy consumed and the buy side is where we don't pay nearly enough attention. We could improve energy productivity, energy efficiency enormously. And I'll point to the built environment. 40% of the energy of the carbon emissions come from the energy services that buildings require. We have the know-how today of changing how we do buildings to make all of the energy services, they don't all go away, but what's left is certainly meetable. It can be met by low or no carbon energy sources. So if we focus on, should we supply all of this with coal or with oil or with renewables, we're not going to get there. There's another question related to this on hydrogen. It's completely a hyped market. So that's why I insist on electrons and molecules as opposed to purely hydrogen. 90% of hydrogen today comes from fossil. And if we're going to try to change that while expanding it enormously for transport, good luck. So we've got to think rationally, pragmatically, and in a way that it delivers affordable services to the people who need it. And we're not on the right track. Sorry.
No, I really appreciate that. There's several questions here that are technology specific that I wasn't taking, because with this panel's kind of specialty and expertise of really thinking about, how do we act in progress, but feel free to weave them into your responses. There were some others on Dartmouth transition. We have other seminars that are focusing on that. But in this one in particular, I really appreciated that idea of thinking about the kind of structural tensions within our legacy energy system. And it's great to propose new alternatives and want market-based solutions, but in reality, we also get away from things by not doing them anymore, and we haven't done that part of it. So thank you very much to all of the speakers for making that very, very clear. One of the questions from Jennifer Yan was about, currently there's a rising trend of companies making net zero commitments. How will this impact the process of agenda and overall country goals? And how can these companies be kept accountable to their commitments? Is there a way to leverage an alignment of financial self-interest of these firms to spurring more action? And I'm channeling John Foley from Project Drawdown here, who would say, no, this is a global concept talking about the energy balance of the planet, and having a corporation do this for their supply chains is meaningless. But yet it has become one of the kind of lingua franca of both countries and companies right now. So I'd love your thoughts on that. And let's start with Jenny, and then Tori, and then Scott. We'll let you have that one.
Great. So it's a great question. And net zero is something that is proliferating and has talked a lot about at COP26. And there's a whole constituency of climate justice activists and energy democracy from that perspective that says net zero is not a helpful frame, because it actually doesn't take into consideration the legacy of injustices that were already baked in, right? It's only looking ahead, and that it's really a non-transformative solution, so that it could actually, the argument has been made that it actually is one of these things that slows us down, makes it less ambitious, less transformative commitments, right? Because if you say, oh, we're going to be net zero by whatever year it is, you can keep doing what you're doing right now for several more years, and then gradually do something else in the future that will that then you can say you're net zero. It doesn't fundamentally change anything, and this gets to this challenge of like more radical transformative change versus smaller incremental steps, and so a lot of this smaller and the incremental change we've been trying for decades, and as we've been acknowledging here collectively, we've been completely inadequate, insufficient with what we've been trying. So I think there's a whole movement really for very different approaches, not just calling for a carbon tax, like Scott was mentioning. Carbon tax could be part of a future, but it isn't sufficient in of itself. Like, that's not going to change everything if we have a carbon tax. So some of the ideas are about policies and processes that involve investing in new ways in people and communities, right? In ways that empower people to have renewable-based, healthier lifestyles that are very different, and it involves investment rather than taxing. And that's the idea of kind of thinking about more radical transformative change rather than the smaller kind of incremental steps that all of those are important and can play a role, but they in and of themselves, including a lot of the net zero commitments, are not going to really lead to transformative change. So that would be my response to the net zero question.
Thank you. Tori?
Thanks, Elizabeth. I partly mentioned some of this earlier, and I think maybe I'll actually pitch a question to Scott in a second here. Yes, I think that some of the change can be for countries that are not highly industrialized, not going through that loop and then getting to renewable. And I keep mentioning this. These are countries with low access to energy who are seeking energy resources for which there's much funding. You've heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, that's a big goal, and it should be married up with ambitions on climate. Places like the UN, major companies have also said they're basically at zero equivalent of emissions because they've bought credits. And I've mentioned the new credit market for fragile states, the Peace Renewable Energy Credit Market, which happy to talk about, because otherwise markets are not being driven to places where there's not a high reward already, or there might be conflict, or you have infrastructure challenges. They're not easy, but it's worth investing. So my question to Scott is talking about incentives. The UN says it's zero because it's bought credits. It's offset its energy use. How do we actually get to the Secretary General's goal of being 80% on renewable energy by 2030? Like, talk about walking the walk. Here's an organization, it hosts COP, it hosts development goals, it leads peacekeeping and development issues all over the world, and yet the peace operations show 96% relying on diesel fuel, old generators. So there's all kinds of great people and plans for changing it, but it's moving as slow as you're describing everything else.
I guess that's my cue. I agree very much with the sentiments that you've expressed, and in terms of walking the walk, I'll refer to HUD because I have their number in my mind. The Department of Housing and Urban Development in the US has a lot of buildings under management, and its utility bill every year is about $7 billion. They could actually do serious amounts of work on retrofitting their existing building stock, which not only reduces their bill, but it also reduces their energy consumption and their CO2 emissions. The UN would need to do the same thing throughout its operations. You've already talked about the peacekeeping operations. I insulted the whole process of gathering people for COPs by bringing 20,000 people to a faraway place. That sort of behavior of simply buying your ticket to go someplace doesn't make sense. COVID has taught us so much about a different way of doing it. And I don't think we've really fully appreciated how mobility can be delivered in different ways. So the ideas of circular economy, the ideas of getting the buildings and getting our energy supplies to low or no carbon is something we clearly should be doing more of. I want to come back to a couple of things that Jenny said about the carbon price. I want to make sure that we understand when I say carbon price or carbon tax, I'm not talking about $40 per ton. I'm not talking about $80 per ton. I'm not talking about $120 a ton. We're talking north of $140 a ton. And that's the kind of level that you will need quickly if you want people's behavior and if you want investments to start responding. There are other things you need to do on the policy side. I completely agree with that. But right now, we're in a world where money talks. As you said, I mean, I said it earlier, but you reinforced it, but 80% of the energy mix today is fossil. People are not going to give up going to get their dry cleaning or going to a movie or doing this, doing that. They don't want to be dictated to. So it's up to us as the industry, us, all of the energy industry, of providing energy services in a low carbon, no carbon way. And I think that's where the challenge needs to be. We asked the engineers to put together a system that delivered loss of load probabilities so the lights wouldn't flicker. We asked them to deliver shale gas, and they do all of that really well. We need to change the challenge, and we need to challenge them to provide quality energy services with low carbon energy sources. And you will get the answer. I know we have the technology. I know you all have been talking about it. We have the capital today. It's about changing the rules of the game so that the actors in that game deliver what society requires. And that's where the question came back to me on this in the Q&A. We've got to enable the politicians to write the rules that deliver the results that we require.
I really appreciate that. I mean, one of the pieces that you talked about earlier, Victoria, was how if you change the rules on budgeting from 1 year to 5 years, you would end up with a lot more renewable projects. You see the same thing with energy efficiency. We soon should be moving into our building on campus, which will be the most energy efficient building on campus. But for me, that should be all the new buildings at the Dartmouth campus, right? There's a question here on how do we think about Dartmouth's energy transition. I mean, the first piece is use less energy for the services you have. And yet, you know, for all of our institutions, our budget-based practices and how we've thought about and structured our decisions don't necessarily let us factor in those types of outcomes into our current models. And so I think you're right. This is a bigger question than renewables in South Sudan or transforming the UN or even our small college campuses and our communities. But really, it's these larger structural questions of how do we change the structure and institutions to support this very different kind of decision making. Jenny, you had brought up some of the societal inequities in kind of resources and wealth, and Thomas Piketty's Capital, I think, is one of the books that I've read over the last decade that has really highlighted kind of the structural wealth inequalities. A question we have here from Anthony Enka. It seems we're maybe all too familiar with the disparities that cause and affect the developing countries with regards to climate change. I'm keen to learn and hope the distinguished panel could share more broadly on the risk and opportunity presented by the energy transition for around the world and low and moderate income economies. How can we ensure the transition to low carbon economy addresses fuel poverty and ensures universal access to clean energy? And I'll let whoever wants to take that one first.
Well, I would just jump in quickly. Oh, sorry, do you want to go, Scott? And just say that that question gets exactly at a really important point, that it's not renewables at all costs, right? It matters how it's done, who is included, who is excluded, who benefits, who profits, and that's where the principles of energy democracy, of kind of being inclusive and thinking and investing in ways that it's not just the investors who benefit, but distributing that and the leveraging the distributive power of renewable-based energy future for the benefit of those countries and communities that have been excluded and marginalized for all different reasons and different legacy and historical contexts. So I think that question that Anthony asked is fundamental and something that we need to, I mean, there's no easy answer like how to ensure it, right? It matters to pay attention to how these policies, how the incentives, how the investments are made, and that it's not, as I said, it's not renewables, no matter how you do it, right? We could have a renewable-based system that is still very concentrated wealth and power with just a handful of companies profiting and kind of exploiting and extracting from the rest of us. So that's not what we want. We want, the potential is there for a renewable-based future to not be that, and to actually allow local ownership, local control, in a way that could bring all kinds of co-benefits that are really powerful. And so that's why we want to pay attention. We have to pay attention so much to energy policy, energy investments, and try to guide those in ways and change, as Scott said, I love that, change the rules of the game so that that isn't being incentivized to have benefits for people, not just the corporations.
Scott, do you want to add on to that? I mean, I appreciate that in some parts of the country that model may work well, in other parts of the world a little bit less well. And so
I'd like to respond to that, if I may, with two distinct points. The first is that we are working, we're leading the charge in my division on a working party for the Secretary General on extractive industries. And we have a 5-point program that we're pursuing. I won't go through all of the points, but the first one is that the license to operate is insufficient, inadequate. It needs to be a social, environmental, economic license to operate where the local communities are benefiting. Not, I don't know about control, I'll leave that one on the side, but that there's a shared benefit from the extraction of the resources and the development of the resources. And that's through the whole value chain of the resources. The second one is developing a financial framework, a financial taxonomy, so that when the investment banks are coming in and putting the funding in place for the development of resources, that their filtering process takes full account of these various dynamics. And then the final part, the third of 5, not the final, is working on transparency and traceability. So that if you are going to come up with, let's say, hydrogen, that you know that hydrogen that you're consuming is green hydrogen and not somehow black or yellow hydrogen. So it gives confidence to the market. And then there's a secondary market, and you get a financial flow that encourages the outcomes that you actually had in mind. So that's one element. The second one, I already mentioned the work that we're doing on high performance buildings. And without going into detail, we started that program based on energy efficiency. It then became energy and climate efficiency. And suddenly you find that there's a whole spectrum of outcomes from the built environment that is absolutely essential. You're dealing with health, mold and mildew causing allergies, missed days from school. You're talking about homogeneous temperatures. You're talking about indoor air pollution, outdoor air pollution. There's a whole social justice, affordability, resilience with weather. You suddenly realize that if you get the built environment done right, you can solve a lot of problems. It's raising the quality of life. So if we can disseminate and deploy our guidelines on doing the built environment right around the world, lo and behold, we're helping low and middle income countries deliver quality of life to their citizens at least cost. And that's a hugely positive outcome.
No, I really appreciate that. I'm going to take Tori, and then I'm going to ask each of you to give me some kind of last thoughts. So like a minute or so on that you just want to leave us with. We have a bunch of additional questions that we won't be able to get to, but I encourage you to look at those and feel free to type answers in as we wrap up. But Tori, your thoughts on the question at hand, and then I'll go in the opposite order that we spoke, so you can go into your wrap-up comments. Just let us know when you're doing that. We'll do that.
Okay. So I'll start with the energy poverty question. There is great data. So pick the countries that have 25% or less, access to energy, right? That's where you start. And you say, okay, what are the resources already going here for development, for access to energy, and for climate mitigation? And almost every country in the world has what's called a UN country team. And for the United States, we have the Agency for National Development, and the US government is also operating those places. That is resources that should be plugged in at the most local level to what communities need. One country, many different needs. Working with the governments, working with the nonprofit sector, working with civil society, design plans, and then speaking up. And there's a series of compacts that have been designed by the UN and others to say, here are the goals, here are the ambitions for climate, here's the ambitions for development. And then you go out, and whether it's the money coming out of the COP announcement with Bezos and others, or it's a local bank, or it's a community enterprise, build up from what those aspirations are. And that can be a very sturdy approach, I think, to try and deal with energy poverty. So now, Elizabeth, I'll transition briefly.
I think she just froze. So we'll let her transition when she unfreezes. How about we go to you, Jenny? Just your 1 minute, 45-second last thoughts.
Okay, great. Well, so what I would encourage everyone to think about is climate justice action and sustainability more broadly, in addition to climate and energy tech, the conventional way of thinking about climate and energy. So to integrate the social justice component in our local initiatives and in our state and national and international engagement as well. So at every level. And I think there's so much space when we do that to actually open up the conversation, so we're not having the same conversation that we had 10 years ago, and that we're actually moving toward a more inclusive approach, and engaging by connecting climate energy with all the other social justice and democracy issues that we're dealing with throughout in our own communities and in countries, communities throughout the world. So I think really connecting with commitment to social justice in our climate energy work is really essential for us to change, so that we can actually have bigger.
Well, and I really appreciate how a lot of the young scholars in this space, Erin Mayfield, Destiny Knock, and a bunch of others, are really pushing us in that direction. And even the Department of Energy now has its Energy Justice Lab. So Shalonda Baker and Tony Reams really helping support that conversation too. Scott, your last thoughts, and maybe we'll get Tori back. Oh, here she comes. Let's go to Scott, and then Tori, you're next.
All right, thank you very much. It's been interesting to hear the comments and the observations. I think I'll close with two very short ones. The first one is defining the word fair. What is fair and what is just? It is true that the industrialized Western world started this process in the 1850s. So most of the CO2 that's up there is our fault. And for us to then expect the rest of the world to forego their own quality of life aspirations because we've decided that the planet's burning, even if it was our fault, they can't start any fires. That's not fair. So there needs to be some kind of gut check on how do we address this inequality. And simply shrugging our shoulders and saying, too bad for them, is not going to work. It's not a solution. The second comment is, I do believe that the path to the future is going to be one that involves all technologies. We cannot be so politically correct that we start rejecting them. We have to make sure that every technology can play the role that it's going to have to play. And we have to enable actors who can act at scale, let them work and deliver at scale. That does mean communities, that does mean local folks, but it also means some of the people who have concentrations of power.
Thank you so much. Tori, can you share with us your last thoughts? I really appreciate that. We're at time, and I want to share the last slide of our new events. Thank you.
Sorry, I think Zoom decided to update. I think my last thought is that often we want the big speech, the big initiative, the big Security Council resolution. That's been my world. And then we forget about implementation. It doesn't solve everything, but sometimes it's sitting in plain sight. And if we could just implement half the stuff we've all agreed to, we'd be in a much better place. We'd have an energy democracy. We'd have the change Scott's called for. And Elizabeth, your institute may lead the way. So thank you for inviting me. And let's go implement half the stuff we've talked about.
Tori, wonderful, and thank you so much for coming back. And Steph, could you put on the upcoming events? Super big thank you to the panel. Thanks for everybody for hanging in with us and the questions. You know, our real push was how do we get to action? Our new energy series, February 2nd, Joan Casey talking about power outages and environmental justice, which communities are affected during times of climate risk. This series, the DEC is part with us and Rivers and the Sustainability Office and Thayer as well. But Thayer also has its own Rivers Power Up. And so on Thursday, several of you are asking questions about nuclear. They'll be having a Nuclear 101. And then the next DEC will be thinking about tribal energy in North America after COP26. David Conrad from the DOE Indian Energy Policy and Amy Barnes, our board member from Huanani Partners, will be part of that. And so thinking about even within the United States context, the very different tribal nations and what energy and energy justice means to them. We'll be at that conversation. Thank you everybody for being part of this. We sure appreciate it and look forward to continuing engagements and conversations with you sooner and later. Take care all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.